tool, which is currently being hosted by Creative Commons and may move elsewhere, which is called Discover Ed, and it's a tool that enables people to find educational resources online with particular attention to open educational resources. And the archive this tool is sort of built on and searches across continues to grow regularly. And you can go check that out at discovered.creativecommons.org. And there's also a community site, which again is currently hosted by Creative Commons but may find a home elsewhere. And that site's called OpenEd. And that's a really great place to go if you want more information about open education, about Creative Commons licenses in that domain, and also just to connect with different people and projects in and around the community. And that's it for the overview presentation, and I'm happy to dive into anything in greater detail.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Atras. That was extremely interesting. We have one question that's come through just from Maita. She'd just like to know kind of what would the normal person, just a regular teacher or whatever, have to do in order to get a CC license for some of their work?
So CC licenses, anyone can apply it, and it can be applied to anything covered by copyright as long as you're the copyright holder. So for a typical person, anything you create, if you feel that's what you want to do, you can just go ahead and slap a CC license on there. The easiest way to do that on an individual basis is either to go to the Creative Commons site, and there's a link there which says license your work, and it asks you a few basic questions. And based on your response, it will then give you the license you've chosen. And it also gives you a little bit of code that you can just cut and paste if it's a digital object and embed it in whatever it is that you've created. Now, most people don't actually license their works that way. They'll first go to some kind of a repository. So, for example, if what you're trying to license is a photo, you can upload your photo to a service like Flickr or Picasa, and as part of the upload process, it gives you the option to use a Creative Commons license. And those two applications, for example, have built in the licensing technology that Creative Commons created to the upload process, so it does it all for you automatically. You can get similar benefit by uploading your slideshows to SlideShare, or your documents to something like Scribd or the Internet Archive or whatever. So part of what Creative Commons is doing is trying to make it so that Creative Commons licensing sits in all the various places where people are likely to place their own content, whether it be music or videos or slideshows or whatever, and have it so that you can very easily choose there rather than having to go to the Creative Commons site. Hopefully that helps. There's one thing I'd say about that. There's some confusion when you're a teacher as to whether or not you do own the copyright to work you create. Some institutions claim that copyright. Sometimes they don't. And I can't answer that question generally because it's enormously variable. So it's the kind of thing you would need to talk to your colleagues and to your institution about as to whether you have the right to decide how you distribute your own work.
That's great, Harish. Mike has said that was great, and thank you. We've another question. Lawrence Cook, he says, I know that you've already talked about why the no commercial use license is not great, but would you care to comment on that any further?
Sure. So the key issue with the non-commercial license is to understand its primary intent. And its primary intent is to protect your own commercial interests. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to use the non-commercial constraint unless you are intending to directly profit from selling that work, such as you might be if you were, say, a musician and you have a song and you're trying to get people to buy the song. And yes, you want to distribute it, but you don't want other people selling the song. Now, in education, most often, based on extensive interviews, people use it because they don't like the idea that someone else might find some way to make some money on it, even though they have no intention of ever actually selling it themselves. And that's a really important thing to sit back and think about, because it's not clear to me, certainly, why it is necessarily bad for someone to identify some way of taking a work you had no commercial interest in and coming up with a clever way of getting people to pay for something around it. It's unlikely they'd be able to sell it directly because obviously it's available for free. You published it and it's up there. They have to attribute you, so people will know there's a free version, and you will get presumably a lot of credit and exposure from that. So it seems like you would want to encourage that kind of behavior, not discourage it. And indeed, if it turns out that your work is extremely lucrative, nothing's stopping you from creating another thing like that and then actually, becoming a business person. The real issue, beyond just the fact that it doesn't usually make a lot of sense, is that the non-commercial term doesn't play well with other openly licensed objects. So if you're trying to combine two things, say a photo and some text, and one is non-commercially licensed and the other isn't, you can't necessarily stick them together because there's a legal incompatibility at play. And so it ends up being, I guess you could think of it as essentially layering on restrictions to the use of the work, which may actually undermine the original purpose you had in mind in both creating and sharing it in the first place. So I always tell people there's lots of great reasons to use a non-commercial license, but just make sure they're the right reasons. And in education, I find more often than not, it's not too easy to justify it unless you're really intending to monetize it directly.
Okay, thanks, Arash. We have a couple of more questions. So Karen says, sometimes you might want to license some materials for educational use rather than for non-commercial use. She says, is there an educational CC license? I suggest this as a far-right organization might use a photo of mine for their non-commercial activities.
So there is no education-specific license. Some people feel like maybe the non-commercial license gets there, but hopefully all the reasons I just said kind of help you understand that may not be quite right. The main reason why there is no education-specific license is because defining educational, especially in a universal way, is basically impossible. Some people have tried, and the closest they're able to come up to is to constrain it to formal education, thereby cutting out everybody who might want to be learning outside formal institutional environments. And even then, you would have to define how you know that someone is truly affiliated with a formal educational institution or only using it in that context. And it quickly becomes a sort of a bottomless pit of definitions and redefinitions and trying to sort of get things to work. And we really did spend quite a lot of time, we being when I was part of Creative Commons, trying to make that work. And you just run into this place where you say, you know what, we can never define that universally. And as a result, it's no longer a public license once you start layering in the constraints on use. So it's not going to happen. Creative Commons is not going to offer an education-specific license because we don't even know how to define that. And again, I would just say that it's really important that people try to understand those motivations. I mean, I think everybody kind of has this same initial reaction to the thought that, gee, I think this thing I did or created is really valuable, and while I'm happy to have fellow educators or people who are trying to learn something benefit from it, I don't necessarily want, big name publisher or, XYZ brand company to profit from it in some way, because that just sort of strikes people as somehow wrong. And I don't disagree with that that sort of feeling, but I still think you sort of have to step back for a second and say, okay, now wait a minute, they have to attribute me. And let's say Coke or some big brand name grabs this resource, somehow bundles it with Coke cans, but gets it out to millions of students as a result.